Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's webinar, How to Build a Unicorn, an exclusive conversation with Sandra Daniels, co-founder of Thumbtack. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Wendy Maldonado D'Amico, Yale College class of 1993, and a director of Accelerate Yale and Yale Angels. Our discussion this evening is co-sponsored by Yale Law School. Accelerate Yale is a global community of alumni and friends of Yale who are engaged in innovation, tech, and entrepreneurship. Please note that we are being recorded this evening with all participants muted. Tonight's session will be 1 hour, and we will reserve the final 25 minutes for your questions. If you have a question that you'd like to submit, please do so via the Q&A button at the bottom bar of your screen. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our featured speaker and our moderator for this evening. First, our moderator. Gary Stewart is Yale class of 1996 and JD 99 from the law school. He is the CEO and founder of Founder Tribes, an app that gamifies founder education and provides access to mentors and fundraising. He is the former CEO and co-founder of The Nest, a mobile app that could be called Masterclass for Founders. From 2014 to 2019, Gary was the director of Wyra UK, a corporate accelerator backed by Telefonica. From 2010 to 2014, Gary was an associate professor of entrepreneurship at IE Business School in Madrid and CEO of Wyra Spain. Excuse me. He launched his first startup in 2005. Before becoming an entrepreneur, Gary worked as a lawyer in the US, UK, and Spain. He graduated magna cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa from Yale College, and was the executive editor of the Yale Law Journal at Yale Law School. He is a governor of the University of East London and has been on the power list of the most influential Black people in the UK. He is a member of the leadership teams of Accelerate Yale and Yale Angels. And now our featured speaker for this evening, Sandra Daniels. Sandra Daniels is Yale College class of 2005 and JD 09 from Yale Law School. He is a co-founder of Thumbtack, which he helped start with two friends while he was in his second year of law school at Yale. From plumbers and painters to DJs and personal trainers, Thumbtack helps millions of customers each year find the right professional for their project in about 500 categories. This translates to more than $1 billion in annual revenue for our professionals across the US, helping them grow their businesses on their own terms. Founded in 2008 and headquartered in San Francisco, Thumbtack is backed by over $400 million in investment from Sequoia Capital, Google Capital, Tiger Global Management, Javelin Investment Partners, and Bailey Gifford. Sandra, it is an honor for Accelerate Yale to host you this evening for our final webinar of 2020. Thank you so much for joining us. And now I'm going to turn it over to my friend, Gary Stewart. Gary.
Thanks, Wendy, as usual, for an amazing introduction. I always feel so great about myself afterwards, and I know, Sandra, you probably do as well, even though yours is probably more deserved. I think the way I kind of wanted to start this was telling a story about how Sandra and I actually met. It was only last year during our law school reunion, and Anastasia and Sharon Brooks from the law school basically said to me, hey, there's this guy that you really need to meet. Because I guess being at Yale Law School and being an entrepreneur, I always kind of felt like a little bit like an outsider, like a bit of a loser. Like, why didn't I actually just continue with the law? You know, at least the way that maybe my friends might see me who had kind of chosen to go the traditional route. And then all of a sudden I met this guy in the pizza line at the reunion, my 20th reunion, the first one I went to. And Anastasia was like, you really need to meet him. And I said to him, oh, what do you do? And he's like, oh, I'm an entrepreneur. I have a marketplace. So I start asking him a bunch of questions. And he's like, yeah, you know, we've raised like about like $450 million. And I was like, okay, I guess I'll stop asking the questions now. Because it seems like you know what you're doing better than me, obviously. And then I think beyond that, when I went to San Francisco later on in the year, I kind of reached out to Sandra and said, hey, I'm here. And he's like, hey, why don't we meet up? I went to his office. And then eventually he invested in my company. And so it just kind of reinforced the notion of like, there are a lot of really great entrepreneurs at Yale. Some of them have become unicorn founders, create these amazing businesses. And so we just kind of need to get to know them. And some of them will eventually invest in you, like Sandra did in my company when I told them a bit more about what we did. So that's why I'm really honored to have Sander with us here today. Sander, thank you for joining us. Yeah, I guess maybe we can start with a little bit about your own story. I mean, like, you've heard me tell your story, you've heard Wendy tell your story a little bit. Now it's time for you to tell your story. What's your 1-minute pitch? How would you explain a bit about how you got to where you are right now?
Well, first of all, thanks a million for the wonderful intros, Wendy and Gary. I'm thrilled to be here tonight and chatting with all of you. And I'm excited to talk in particular at some point about the Yale entrepreneurial community. It is thriving. There are so many of people like you and us out there. And it has been a delight getting to know you, Gary, over the last few years and meeting at the law school reunion. So there's so many people out there like us, and it's part of my mission to help grow that community. So my story, well, let me just start with the very nuts and bolts. What is Thumbtack? Thumbtack is a marketplace for local services. So if you're looking for a contractor for your home, or a photographer for your wedding, or a tutor for your kid, you can go and find that on Thumbtack. Like Wendy and Gary shared, we started it in 2008, and through lots of ups and downs, the team is now about 800 people located in 3 geographic centers. We used to say offices, now geographic centers, in San Francisco, Salt Lake, and the Philippines. And yeah, those are the basics, and we can dive into kind of the early founding story or any part of that. But that's the nuts and bolts of Thumbtack.
So I guess the hard part is, for a lot of people to understand, maybe, is I think we were at an event yesterday with Dean Gerken and Anastasia, who I just saw left a message. And you said when you went to law school, you knew you actually didn't want to be a lawyer. You kind of always had this like entrepreneurial thing within you. So tell us a little bit about why you went to law school, and how did you kind of hack the law school experience so that this entrepreneurial, DNA came out, and how did you find your co-founders while you were in law school?
Yeah, so starting from a really early age, I felt lucky for the opportunities I'd been given. It was nothing super out of the ordinary, but I knew that if I worked hard and put my mind to it, I would be able to make an impact. So the first route that took for me was in undergrad. In addition to studying engineering, I studied history, politics, philosophy, and I followed that up and went to law school. I thought I was going to be in the political world my entire career. I had grown up in Virginia, right outside of Washington, D.C. And so I thought, all right, well, law, public policy is one way to make a big impact. So while I was there, I kept in touch with a couple friends, one of whom was my best friend from undergrad. We had started the club soccer team together, freshman year together, and stayed good buddies since then. He and then another friend we met afterwards were working at the White House at the time. They had gone a similar direction for similar motivations, but we got together and we said, well, politics is one way to make a difference, but there's another way to make a difference, which is technology. So for a year, we had weekly phone calls where we brainstormed ideas of things we could start that, if successful, would create opportunities for people. We were not set on it being a tech company. We were considering nonprofits, political advocacy organizations. But what we eventually landed on was the idea for Thumbtack. We said, there's a real human problem to be solved here. For consumers, it's kind of a pain for them to find trustworthy local help for the right price. But the human problem is perhaps even more acute for people on the other side of the marketplace. We call them service professionals. For them, their number one concern is, where do I find my next customer? Where do I put money in my pocket next? Food on the table for my family next? And it was clear that the solutions out there were broken. It was like people getting yellow pages delivered to their front doors, or thumbtacking their yoga business card to a local coffee shop bulletin board. And we said, that's not how this is going to work in the future. We also looked around and said, there's probably a big business opportunity here. There are these global marketplaces for products, Amazon, eBay, Alibaba, but there's no global marketplace for services yet. So let's go try to build that. And that's what we've been building since day one. But I will never forget those early brainstorm phone calls when I was pacing in my tiny apartment loft on Orange Street in law school. Those were back in the day.
So then fast forward, like after graduation, you graduate, it's the middle of a recession. People are talking about like the worst recession since the Great Depression, so bad that we get like a black president even. And you're basically like, okay, now I'm going to create a startup. You have a stable job at Sullivan and Cromwell, like where I also work, one of the top like 2 or 3 law firms in the entire country, maybe world, and you leave it. What do your parents and your friends say? They're like, it's a recession, you have a really good job, super prestigious, and you're leaving it to go chase this startup dream. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So there were a bunch of obstacles to starting the company in the early days, but they're not things that people often think about, I think. So for me, convincing myself to take this risk and take the leap into this was by far the easiest part of it. I thought, okay, if there's ever a time to take a career risk, it's right after graduation or very early in your career. Also, if and when this thing fails, the Yale credential will allow me to get a job. So I'm going to be able to survive. It's not like I'm going to go into destitution if and when this thing fails. So convincing myself was not an issue. The major things were really kind of the social pressure against doing that. So it's kind of hard to rewind 10, 12 years, but back in 2008, 2009, tech was not part of the social zeitgeist like it was now. People were not going to San Francisco. I think in my undergrad class at Yale, there were maybe like 9 computer science majors. I understand there's hundreds or 100 plus today. So, the thought that somebody was going to go across the country, away from the East Coast to this foreign land in San Francisco and work on some dumb thing was kind of like, my friends thought it was crazy. At best, they were neutral. At worst, they were kind of like, why would you do this? But then the hardest part was my parents. It was like, okay, I had just gotten married. I knew I had a kid on the way. I was at this prestigious law firm job. You're telling me, Sander, that you are going to give up this fancy, high-paying job that will provide for your family to go do this, dumb thing with your friends who we don't know? Like, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. So that overcoming those like social and family pressures were probably the hardest part of it. Yeah, so it was pretty interesting back then.
And then you kind of go to San Francisco, which, with all due respect, I've been to Silicon Valley, and I'm like, I'm sure they make a lot of money, but it looks pretty boring. And on top of it, I know this from our interview before, just very different from the East Coast potentially. And then on top of it, like, you spend the first 2 or 3 years not achieving the success that you kind of imagine in your mind's eye when you're like, I'm going to go out there and prove everyone wrong. So tell us about those kind of first 2 or 3 years in San Francisco / Silicon Valley, and kind of like, what was it like? And did you find a Yale community, or did you have to recreate a whole new community?
Well, it's funny, in the early days, you just do anything you can to get by. So I didn't have school debt like a number of my friends did, but I did have a family to support. And so the other founders at Thumbtack, they lived together in an apartment. They earned almost no income. They could be true kind of like single dudes living in an apartment. I couldn't do that because I had a family. And so I had to be strategic first about how I kind of like funded this for myself. So my thought was, okay, I'm going to get this law firm role in part to potentially fund this risk. And so I said, I put a I calculated the amount of time I would need to work at the law firm in order to save up enough money to then go without an income for 12 or 18 months. I started at Sullivan and Cromwell, that law firm you mentioned, in November of 2009. And I put a note on my refrigerator the morning I started, and I said, you will leave Sullivan and Cromwell by January 31st, 2011. That was the amount of time I had calculated I would need to be there to save up the money to then go fund this other thing I wanted to do. So I did just that. I worked at Sullivan and Cromwell hard and did great work, and I'm proud of the work I did there. But on the side, at nights and on the weekends, I was Thumbtack's first and only customer service agent. I was responding to tickets in Zendesk on the weekend. And I ended up leaving the law firm that last week of January 2011, which happened to be the same week my kid was born. So we left the law firm, we moved away from DC, we showed up in San Francisco. And yeah, I mean, at Thumbtack, we wandered in the wilderness for years. We can talk more about this, but the way we built the company was very much focused on building the right product and then marketing it at scale to users. One thing we were not focused on in the early days was publicity, public relations, pitching ourselves to the media, startup competitions. And so we were not really part of the glamour and glitz in Silicon Valley. Nobody was talking about us or writing articles about us for years. But we saw the traction that we were getting from our product from normal Americans in Middle America and, Tallahassee, Florida, and Fairfax, Virginia, and Dallas, Texas. Nobody really was using our product in the tech elite. People weren't chattering about us. We weren't getting fancy launches at South by Southwest or anything like that. And that was hard because we had to believe in ourselves and trust in ourselves and sit in this apartment and do it ourselves. But at the same time, in retrospect, we ended up being focused on the right things rather than the wrong things. So.
And I remember when I interviewed you for the Nest Now Founder Tribes, we were talking about like what it's like to be unsexy, because it's like a lot of investors seem to kind of move in trends and waves of like, Facebook was hot and this other thing was hot, and you guys weren't really in a hot space per se. Marketplaces for, blue collar workers or whatever, that's not like a trend that they were really focusing on. So how did you overcome the fact that you were outside of a particular bubble that people were looking at?
Oh, Gary, I mean, it was hard to stay the course. I'll start with the answer, which is we had our vision 100% on building this global platform, this marketplace for local services. We believed in the idea. We knew that it was an idea whose time would come. We just needed to build and survive until the time for that idea came. But meanwhile, there was trend after trend after trend that kind of came and ultimately went. But, in 2011, 2012, Groupon came out of nowhere, for example, and we were out raising money around then. And I can't tell you how many venture capitalists came to us and said, your current model is okay, but it would be really great if you all created a Groupon company. And we were like, no, we don't really believe that deeply in daily deals. And they were like, how can you not believe it? Look at the metrics of this company. So I can't tell you how many things there were like that. But another thing I will say is that trends do come and go. And when you're raising money and talking to investors, it is heavily trend driven. When we went out to raise our Series A round in starting in the summer of 2010, we thought we were hot stuff. We had good metrics, good user growth. We went out, we started talking to venture capitalists. We didn't know why, but they weren't giving us second conversations. And so we talked to more and more venture capitalists. Eventually we talked to 45 VCs. They all said no. We almost ran out of money 4 or 5 months later. And one firm called Javelin, who should forever get credit for this, they did end up investing. But it goes to show, like 45 VCs all missed out on what could have been, the best investment they ever made. And there's a lot of just like, who are the cool kids at the table? Which venture capitalist said yes to invest in this company? Okay, I'm going to follow that. It's hard to get around that. It's hard to get around that.
So I'm going to throw out 2 terms and you tell me like what you think, or like, let's unpack them, I guess. The first is grit, because I remember that like when we talked, you were like, the number one thing for an entrepreneur is grit, because there are those days. And I remember the story when you told about how you just literally started cold calling people. And I think it was Peter Thiel that you just randomly cold called because you were like, we're going to run out of money and I just have to make this happen. So that was the first one. And then the second is networking, which is that a lot of this does seem to rely on finding someone credible that believes in you. And you guys kind of met Jason Calacanis at one point, and he kind of believed in you. So help me to understand a bit about like the role that grit plays in this, because people think of it as an overnight success story, but it was really kind of like a 10 to 12 year story that we're really talking about. And people are only seeing the kind of, pre-IPO moment of it. And the second is, and what role does networking play in all of this?
Yeah, so I have always kind of had a long-term focus. I've found personally that the things most rewarding in life are the things I've dedicated the most amount of time to. So school, my marriage and friendships and relationships, and kind of the things in my career. If I do something, I want to make sure I do it right. And of course, there's a balance to be struck between like, are you holding on to something too long? On the one hand, while staying committed, but I've personally always tilted to, all right, let's be thoughtful up front before committing to something. But once I commit to something, I'm all in. We've thought of Thumbtack as kind of a multi-decade project. We knew going in that the idea was big enough to support a generational iconic tech firm. And so again, all we had to do is survive. And we have, for better or worse, had that kind of like survival mentality throughout the entire thing. There were periods that were really exciting and we were growing. And, after that 4 or 5 years of wandering in the wilderness, we had raised $3-4 million from a handful of angel investors. Then over the course of the next 18 months, then we became the new cool kid in town and we raised $150 million over the next 18 months. And then, so the company was growing for 3-4 years. And then the following 2-3 years were again really, really hard. Like call it the 2016 to 2018 period. Our initial business model had reached its limits, and we needed to rethink our whole business model and rebuild it really. So we spent 18 months, put the business on hold to set it up for kind of what could be the next decade of success. And so there have been lots of ups and downs. And, when those downs happen, you just kind of do anything you can to scrape through them and get through them. Yeah, when we were about to go out of business, trying to raise that early VC round I mentioned, we were doing anything. And, I learned during that time that cold emails can oftentimes, can oftentimes be as good as any other type of message you send. And so we were emailing kind of anybody we knew. And I wrote an email to Peter Thiel saying, I found his personal email from somebody and I sent him a message and I said like, hey, here's who I am. I worked at Sullivan and Cromwell too, Peter, just like you. And by the way, I've started this thing with some friends. Are you interested in chatting? He responded to me in like 5 minutes, which I think he would do for most anybody who has an interesting pitch. And he said, sure, meet my team at Founders Fund. And we went in and pitched at Founders Fund, and they rejected us. But, you know, grit has, and long-termism has been an important kind of a part of our culture at Thumbtack. Nothing comes easy. Nothing comes easy, and you gotta fight for every little bit. And then networking. You know, what I have found, networking as such, meeting people just to meet people, we've been less interested in that. One thing we have been more interested in is curiosity, exploring new things, following our curiosity and passion. Oh, this thing over here, this new feature, this new technology looks pretty interesting. I want to learn more about that. And then going and finding the people who are best at that thing, so you can learn from them. One of the most pivotal moments at Thumbtack's journey was in the early days. One of my co-founders, another Yale alum, he was meeting up with some friends at a bar. He sat down at this bar, started chatting with the guy next to him. The guy asked him about Thumbtack. The guy pulls up his phone and starts searching Google search results. And he's like, oh, did you know you all have a huge SEO opportunity? And my founder looked at him and said, what's SEO? Well, SEO turns out it's search engine optimization. It's the art and science of getting your business's listings to the top of Google search. We had never heard of SEO. Turns out SEO ended up building much of Thumbtack. In the early days, we became world experts in SEO. And I tell that story because it was really like our curiosity, sharing the story of Thumbtack, talking to people about the business's challenges that we were facing, that created that serendipitous networking moment. That person turned out to be one of the greatest SEO people in the world, and he was one of our earliest angel investors and biggest promoters. So I think curiosity, follow your curiosity and your passions and talk to people about those, and that will take you good places. It certainly did for us.
So let's go back to the rough moments, because I think like most entrepreneurs feel like we live in the valley, right? So how did you guys get out of the valley? Tell us a little bit about how did you find your very first angel investors, and then how did you get Sequoia? Because I guess it's like, you know, for everyone, Sequoia is this like storied firm. Like I said, the Airbnb IPO, they just made 12 billion. I think they did WhatsApp, they did YouTube, they did Google, they did everybody. And you're one of their biggest bets, from what I understand, in terms of that they've put in more than $100 million to support you because they believe in your business. So tell us, how did you get that first angel investor? And after 3 or 4 years of being rejected by everybody, how did you get Sequoia?
Yeah. So back when we started, accelerators didn't exist or barely existed. I think Y Combinator started around 2007, 2008. And the angel networks were literally like dinners hosted by a couple rich entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. And so back then it was a lot of word of mouth. We were invited to a dinner one night hosted by this guy, Jason Calacanis, and totally randomly, he seemed to take a liking to the founder who pitched that night and our idea. And he said, sure, I'll invest, I'll put in a little bit of money. And because he said yes, all of his friends followed, and that filled out our initial $1 million angel round. So that was serendipitous. And then we had to show real traction. And that's when, you know, it took another 18 or 24 months before we felt ready to go out to that A round. And we went out to raise that A round. The company almost went out of business, and that traumatized us. We said, never again are we going to put ourselves in a position where we have to raise money in order to succeed. So for the next 18 months, all we focused on was revenue. We put up a number on the office wall, 350,000. That was the amount of money we thought we needed to make every month in order to control our destiny. And so for the next 18 months, everybody's eye was on nothing but that number. And because we wanted to control our destiny. And so we did it. By the end of that 18 months, we'd experimented with a number of business models. We had built the business to hit that number. We did. And so we were showing real traction and growth. And our Series B round was a very different conversation with VCs than our Series A round, whereas nobody really wanted to talk to us in our A round. We went out and we talked to 5 VCs, and we had a term sheet within a week or two. And then again, like I mentioned, the momentum had swung in our favor. So once Sequoia invested, then it was like, oh my gosh, Thumbtack's the new cool kid in town. And we had gotten the gold-plated stamp of approval. And so within a year after that, there were 2 follow-on fundraisers from Tiger and then Google Capital, where we raised, a ton of money. So it was really kind of like, one thing I've learned. Well, let me say this. When I was in undergrad, when I was in law school, I was a real believer in the efficient market hypothesis. I thought the world was, I thought the world was highly efficient. I thought it's not even worth bending over to pick up a $100 bill on the ground because it's already been picked up. Well, having been at Thumbtack now for a decade has completely shattered that illusion. I think the world is way stickier than lots of people think, way stickier than I ever thought. And one of the reasons I have come to believe that is because of our own investing journey. Thumbtack has been the same since the day we started. It's been kind of just a steady, one foot after the other trajectory upward. And our vision has never changed. We've been pitching the exact same story. We're pitching the exact same story to investors today as we did, as I did in law school at a business incubator, to a business incubator competition. I put together a 1-pager about Thumbtack, and back then it's the same story that we're pitching today. So Thumbtack hasn't changed. Really, the only thing that's changed is like the outside world's perception of Thumbtack. Sometimes we've been totally unnoticed. Sometimes we've been overvalued and people, thought we were better than we were. And it's just come and gone in waves. So that has made me see that, Silicon Valley, at least, which is supposed to be one of the most efficient capital allocating machines in the entire world, gets it wrong a lot. And if Silicon Valley gets it wrong a lot, the world is very sticky and there's a lot of opportunity, missed opportunities out there, all that.
And when someone transfers you, I'm assuming it's like one transfer, like $100 million. What do you do with it?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, I'll make that a more serious question, which is you go from like basically being kind of not exactly ramen noodle, but kind of like surviving, to all of a sudden being given what could be viewed as a windfall. But like, how does that change the culture of the company? How did that change you as an entrepreneur? How did it change your relationships with your co-founders? Because I must be like, now I don't know, it would just be kind of weird, like winning the lottery.
You might be surprised. It changes a lot less than you might think. Really, it's kind of like you do the fundraise process, you sign the term sheet, you're excited for about 5 minutes. Maybe you go out to dinner that night to celebrate, The next day, nothing has changed. It's back to work. And in fact, it's even more terrifying than it was previously because there's even more pressure on you to perform than there was. Whereas the day before you sign a term sheet, you felt good, you were growing into the valuation that prior investors had given you. The day after you sign a term sheet, you look at yourself and you say like, holy crap, what have I done? I have a lot of work to do to grow into the valuation that they just signed this term sheet on. So, in some sense, yeah, it's exciting, but in another sense, it for us internally, it actually doesn't change a whole lot. It's just fuel for the fire. We can hire more rapidly, but it just increases the pressure in many ways to perform.
And I guess this is kind of a good segue to COVID, because I remember reading on your LinkedIn, like when COVID first started and people were talking about Black Swan, and I think Sequoia came up with this memo about like, we need to be lean and blah, blah, blah. And you had to like fire for the first time a lot of people. Like, how did that all of a sudden, how did you deal with that? And how did you get through it? I guess now looks like 2021 is going to be better than 2020. So tell us a little bit about kind of your 2020 as a startup with like a lot of money, but that's going through kind of this crisis.
Yeah, it was terrible. So, for us as a business, 2020 has been just an incredible roller coaster, as for many businesses out there. We went into the year, we had set a plan, and we said, okay, here's how we're going to execute it. March comes, or really February, and every developed economy in the world has a Thumbtack-like company in it. And so we've gotten to know many of these international local service marketplaces. So when COVID hit, we were in close touch with these marketplaces all over the world. So when we saw it coming, we pinged Thumbtack in Japan, Thumbtack in India, Thumbtack in Italy, and the Italian Thumbtackers are some of our really good friends, actually. And if you recall, COVID hit them hard early, and they in Italy started sharing with us daily data about the usage of their service. And we looked at that data and we said, like, holy crap, this is not good. This is what our business is going to look like in 6 weeks. So we went and did the financial modeling, and we said, well, based on this Italian data, it's clear that the numbers don't add up. So we're going to cut every cost we can. And then it turns out we need to cut people after that. So we laid off a third of the company in the middle of March. This was like, 200 people or so. Toughest thing we've ever had to do really at the company, just awful. And we did that. We were kind of on the earlier side of tech companies and all companies really of doing a layoff because we had that insight into what was happening in another country. So we had the confidence to do it. And we said, well, if we have to make a tough decision, we should just do it. So we did. March went on, April went on, but then by mid-May, the end of May, it turned out the business was really coming back. Home is now more important than ever. People, it turns out, started spending more and more money on home maintenance than they had previously. And by the middle of the summer, Home Depot and Lowe's were reporting record earnings, and we were kind of in that same boat. So, at the moment, business is good. We kind of have a COVID tailwind because people are spending more on home maintenance than before. But, we're not counting on that going forward. We assume the world will normalize at some point.
And I guess a lot of people, looking again at Sequoia and Airbnb, $12 billion they made, you're one of their biggest bets. IPO market is hot. Is there any sort of pressure now to kind of start thinking about the IPO, or, tell us a little bit about like how, because I guess at some point the investors that put in hundreds of millions need to exit. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, thankfully, our investors are largely long-term oriented. So no, like in terms of pressure to IPO, I wouldn't say that. We think of an IPO as kind of one of the options among a number of how we fund the business. And so there's lots of benefits to an IPO. Your stockholders get liquidity. There's a public price on the company for M&A. It has a nice branding effect. So it's an attractive option, and we're certainly thinking hard about it, but we're not getting like super pressured on a particular timeline, and the market's kind of nutty right now anyway. Like I mentioned, we're just very long-term oriented, and we want to do an IPO when the time is right for us, not when not when anybody else thinks the time is right, the market or otherwise. So we're following our own plan. We'll go public when the time is right.
So I see Wendy's back, so I'm going to ask like one last question, Wendy. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Which is, because I saw Wendy, it's like, I'm like, oh my God, she's coming. Okay, so I guess the question is, so you've now been through this whole entrepreneurial journey. There are lots of Yaleys that would love to follow in your footsteps. I think the numbers say something like 40% of all VCs in Silicon Valley went to Harvard or Stanford, and why shouldn't Yale be up there? Tell us a little bit about kind of what you think Yaleys that want to go into entrepreneurship, whether at the law school or undergrad or any other school within the Yale community, what should they do to be able to follow into your footsteps? That's part one of the question. I said it was one question, Wendy, but two parts. And part two would be, and what should the administration be doing? Because at the end of the day, as I think we've heard in recent discussions, the Yale now has to compete with Stanford and MIT and Harvard to get the best brains into entrepreneurship, because that's where money is really made these days. What do you think the university should be doing more to kind of make sure that we are more entrepreneurial and competing with the Harvards and the Stanfords and MITs in that regard? So the first question is, what should the students be doing if they want to go down that path? And the second question is, what should the administration be doing to make it easier for students?
Well, when I was so just speaking personally, when I was I never imagined that I would start a company. I was not like an entrepreneurial person. I thought I was going to be in DC doing politics my entire life. So seeking out an entrepreneurial community or anything like that, it wasn't really on my radar in undergrad. Now, when I went to law school, that was a little bit different, because I had gone to law school knowing I didn't want to be a lawyer. And I was surprised the first week when I arrived at law school and I realized other people there wanted to be lawyers. So I had always kind of felt like an outsider when I was in law school. I felt like I needed to chart my own path. And that was hard, because at law school, almost all of my friends were going down a very set different path, which was, I'm going to go to a law firm, I'm going to do a clerkship, I'm going to be on Law Journal. And I knew in my heart of hearts that I didn't want to go down that route, but it was so hard to avoid that social pressure to do those things, since everybody was doing it, and that was the pecking order, and that's kind of what determined status. So I was so hungry to find friends at the school who were interested in going a different route than the norm. And I was also so hungry to hear from meet alums who were doing different things, who had gone a different route, not even necessarily like built big businesses, just like done different off-track things. And anytime a speaker like that came to school, I was like in the front row sitting there. And so, for me, a lot of the path, and when those speakers came, I was always the first person to ask the question. And the question was always like, thanks for telling me about like what your most recent time has been. But what I'm really curious about is, walk me through day by day, month by month, what your journey was like from the moment you graduated school, like 3 years or 5 years or 7 years into your career or business, because that's what I really care about. So for me, what Yale gave me was role modeling. And so that makes me feel like what the school can do most is role modeling for current students. It can build a group of interested students who want to connect with alumni in different ways, with speaker series like this, or incubators and angel funding sponsored by alumni, or whatever it is. Connecting alumni role models to students, I think, is in various ways the number one thing the school can do to promote this.
Awesome. And with that, I'm turning over to Wendy and say, yeah, Yale Entrepreneurial Society, I've talked to them, the undergraduates, they're awesome. They do want to be connected. The Yale Law School students want to be connected. So if there are any alumni listening, there are loads of really talented Yale students who are just like you, just maybe 20 years younger, that would be super happy to have you as a mentor, or just give them 5, 10, 15 minutes of your time. So please, if you are interested in doing that, reach out to Wendy, probably instead of me, and we can try to see if we can make that happen, because I do think that there are lots of great entrepreneurs in our ecosystem like Sander. It's just that maybe we haven't done enough to shed light on that. And if we just shed more light on that, then we can kind of have these role models that Sander has been speaking about. So with that, that's it for me, Sander. Thank you so much. And I'll turn it over now to Wendy to moderate the questions.
Sure. So thank you, Gary, very, very much for those questions. You always ask such great questions, and the occasional cheeky question, which is why I enjoy your moderation so much. So I want to just first say to the audience, we're not going to be able to get to all of your questions, so please forgive us. I'm going to try to combine some of the ones that have similar themes to them. But great questions coming in, you guys, seriously. So such a great engaged audience. So to kind of follow on the answer that you just gave, Sander, Sharon Brooks is here. Hi, Sharon, and as is Anastasia Boyko. And there's also Elan Kogan. And Sharon and Elan wanted to kind of take that answer one more step and say, well, what could current students do to take advantage of the resources at Yale that exists now, whether it's at the law school or at the university, to learn as much as they can about entrepreneurship, to kind of get themselves set up for this type of journey? What would you say to them?
So one tool I would suggest is the online alumni network. There is nothing wrong with a cold email. People, I think, are fearful of sending cold messages. They think, oh, I need a warm introduction. That's not true at all. I get messages from current undergrads and law students with some frequency through the alumni portal, and I always look at them, I always read them, I always respond to them. And I've hired people at Thumbtack from those messages. So in the early days, we hired a handful of undergrad interns. A few years ago, a law school student reached out to me and cold, and he said, hey, I am currently at the school. I'm interested in getting into tech. Do you want to chat? Are you available to chat? And I said, sure, come by the office when you're in. He was heading to San Francisco. He did. Turns out I had a role to hire on my team, and he applied and he got the role, and it kind of launched his career in tech. He was at Thumbtack for 3 years, and now he's doing other tech stuff. And so I know that cold emailing can be a pain and a lot of hard work, but it is just a system and a process. And the more conversations you have with people, the more inspired, even if nothing like tangible comes out of it, the more inspired you'll be, the greater your imagination will grow around the opportunities that are out there, the life paths. One other thing that really helped in talking to alums who had gone to school 10, 20, 30 years earlier was hearing from every single person, I never imagined where my career would take me. I had a lot of anxiety as a student about planning my career, every single step, what path would this take me on? Hearing that perspective from those alumni 20, 30 years out really reduced my anxiety around planning every next step. Every next step is so high stakes. It really matters if I get this internship or that job or that clerkship. You know, life is a long game, and life takes many different turns that you will never anticipate. So hearing from those alumni was very impactful for me.
Excellent. So thank you. So we had a bunch of questions around those early years when you were starting Thumbtack. There were questions from Tara and Pian around balancing that loss of personal income from your steady job and making sure that you were kind of working on your startup. And then also the question around, do you think whether it's better to work full-time at your full-time job and devote your weekends and weeknights to your startup rather than going full in on a startup? So that kind of decision-making process, can you talk a little bit about that? And that's the first thing. And then the second thing that quite a few people wanted to know about was how this played into your relationship with your partner, especially with a child on the way. Was your partner working at the time? And how did the two of you come to an agreement on how this would actually work for you as a family?
Really great, important questions, because those were the questions I was thinking hardest about in the early days. It was not about the idea, not about convincing myself whether to do it. It was like figuring out how to make it work logistically, both financially and, partnered with a spouse. How will this work for them? So, honestly, I think there is no one size fits all solution to the question of how you fund this personally in the earliest days, whether to start building a startup on the side while you're at something full time, whether to try to find angel funding or get into an accelerator, which will provide you a really basic income in the early days. It's everybody's financial situation is different, and it's not doing this and taking the leap is possible for anybody, but people have to be very thoughtful about how to sequence this out. There are just super scrappy things. One of our earliest employees, he to fund himself at Thumbtack in the early days with almost no income, he wrote a daily newsletter for somebody. He got a part-time job. He probably made, $10,000 or $15,000 a year, which is not much money, but it was enough to kind of like supplement what he was making at Thumbtack, and then he could survive and do this. And it was writing that newsletter was a pain in the butt because it was a daily newsletter, and it had to cover the latest news up to midnight, and it was out in people's inboxes at 4 a.m. Eastern time. And so he wanted to be out partying on a Friday and Saturday night or hanging out and going to bars, but he had to go home and write this newsletter. So it's a very individualized thing, and it's not easy, but doable, I would say, in almost all cases. And then spouse. So my wife, she is a lawyer. She's a practicing lawyer now, and she was at law school in DC at the time while I was working at that law firm. And I had grown up in Virginia. She had grown up in Virginia. We were high school sweethearts. We are high school sweethearts. And so we thought we were going to be in DC our entire lives, and moving away meant leaving our parents, who we really wanted to be near, particularly as we started having children. Also, she was and is a public interest attorney, and many of the best public interest jobs in the country are in the DC area. So here I am suggesting that we move all the way across the country to San Francisco, where we have no friends really. We're moving away from our parents. We're moving away from the best jobs for her. Well, so that was hard. That was almost deal breaking. And basically, to make a long story short, what I said was, all right, here's what we're going to do. Let's move out there for 12 or 18 months. I'm going to this is one of those things. I just feel like I have to take this risk. And if I don't do it, I'll always regret not having taken it. it's probably going to fail. It's almost, 90% chance going to fail in 12 or 18 months. And when that happens, we're going right back. I promise you, we're going right back to DC. So that was the plan. And for the first couple years, we just kind of assumed that any month we were going to return to DC. But then, we moved out there and Thumbtack kept not failing, and we made friends and built a community. And now we have a community and life out here. And a lot of our family has actually moved out here. So we never would have expected that, but that's how we made that work.
Excellent. Thank you, Sander. I'm going to ask one more question. You guys, it breaks my heart that I can't get to all these amazing questions. So I'm going to ask one more and then we're going to close it out. Several people wanted to know about the effects of COVID on your business and what you've learned about your business that you didn't know before COVID and this past year. So can you talk for a minute about that?
Sure. COVID is just unbelievably unexpected. Hopefully nothing like it ever happens again in any of our lifetimes. I guess what I have found is that, I guess I believe in the resilience of what we're building at Thumbtack even more than I ever have. What we're building is in many ways a utility. We went after a big idea. Everybody needs local services. Local services is a huge part of the American economy, of the global economy. It's a significant part of GDP. And we went out to try to remake that. It was not a sexy thing. Helping middle Americans, helping, plumbers, electricians, carpenters, landscapers. This is not this was not a sexy thing. The users of Thumbtack were not tech-centric San Francisco billionaires. They were not the influencers and social media darlings. They were normal people. And that's the problem that we went out to solve. And we thought if we go and solve a problem that normal everyday people have, it's probably going to be a good business. It's going to be worthwhile. People are going to need it. People are going to use it, and it's going to endure through the ups and downs of the economy or whatever other madness like COVID ends up happening out there. So, I guess I've been inspired by the resilience of the problem, the importance of the problem that we've happened to choose. We're, at Thumbtack, we're proud of we're mission driven. We're proud of the work that we do to put money in the pockets of small businesses in a time when tech is eroding a path to a middle class career for folks in certain ways. We feel like we're rebuilding that path. And so, we're just happy that we're able to do the work we're doing and put money in the pockets of businesses in a tough time.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sander. Okay, so everybody, we're going to have to end it here. First, I wanted to thank Gary for moderating this evening, and Sander, a huge thank you from the Accelerate Yale community for joining us this evening. You could see by all of the questions popping up on the screen, people were just so anxious to hear from you. So thank you again for joining us. I wanted to thank our audience for joining us this evening and for participating in this evening's webinar. We'd also love to thank the Yale Law School for co-sponsoring tonight's event, and the Yale Alumni Association shared interest groups for making this event possible. A recording of tonight's webinar will be posted on the Accelerate Yale YouTube channel, on LinkedIn, and on our Facebook page, and on our website. Just a few things to keep in mind for the new year. Our first webinar of the year will be January 12th. We'll be featuring Jeff Hoffman, who is a Yale College alum. He is a serial entrepreneur and the founder of Priceline. Super interesting guy. And then I also just want to bookmark our first pitch off for Yale Angels that will be taking place on February 23rd. That evening, we're going to be featuring 5 Yale alumni founders of seed and pre-seed companies. All of these founders will be from historically underrepresented communities. And we will be we'll be making the big announcement and opening the competition for those final 5 to be selected. So look out for that announcement before the holiday. A panel of 5 Yale alumni investors will be the judges for that evening to select a winner for that inaugural pitch competition. So we're really, really excited. Gary and I and the rest of the team are in the throes of planning all of that. And as soon as you see that hit, please spread the word. We want to get as many great companies under review as possible so that we get some really spectacular attention for the 5 finalists. So that is that for this evening. Thank you again for joining us, and please look out for the recording. It was wonderful to have you all here tonight. Okay, see you later. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.